Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined by Dr. Al Hájek and Dr. Liz Jackson to talk about Pascal's wager, decision theory, and more besides. And actually, how about let's just begin with you guys briefly saying a word about who you are and what you do, beginning with Liz, and then let's move on to Al.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks so much for having us, Joe. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk to Al about Pascal's wager. Lots of fun stuff. We just wrote a paper together, so it'll be fun to talk about some stuff from that. So just a little bit about me. I'm currently teaching in Toronto at Toronto Metropolitan University. I teach philosophy here. And I'm actually moving to St. Louis University in the summer, so I'll be starting there in July. I did my PhD at Notre Dame. And then I actually went to ANU for a year where Al teaches. So that's one of the ways we got connected. And I was a postdoc there. And then from there, I went to TMU and then SLU. So yeah, and then basically just my interests, I guess, briefly are mainly in epistemology and philosophy of religion. So in epistemology, I'm interested in some of the things we'll talk about today, belief and probability, or what philosophers call credence. I'm interested in what epistemic rationality is, what the different kinds of rationality are, that kind of thing. And then in philosophy of religion, the way I really summarize it is I'm kind of interested in the rationality of religious commitment. And the two main branches of that are kind of faith and then Pascal's wager, which is obviously our topic today. So little about me, little about my interests.
Yeah. I'm Al Hájek, and again, thank you so much, Joe. I'm really pleased to be here. And Liz, it's a real pleasure to be talking with you as well. As Liz said, we've just written this big paper about Pascal's wager. Well, I'm at the ANU, the Australian National University. I did my PhD at Princeton, and I taught for about 12 years at Caltech, and then I moved to the ANU in 2005. And my philosophical interests, well, I guess probability is where I start. You know, I'm a sort of probability first kind of guy. And that gets me into decision theory. It gets me into, as we call it, formal epistemology and philosophy of religion. And this is, of course, the connection to Pascal's wager, where probability and decision theory figures prominently. So yeah, that's what I'm about.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so for the audience, here's basically an outline of the discussion. First, we're going to be talking about some key concepts like probability, utility, expected utility theory, and whatnot. Then we're going to be getting into the wager itself, after which we'll be talking about some prominent objections to the wager and maybe some connections to other paradoxes or problems like the St. Petersburg Paradox / problem. Okay, so let's start with key concepts, and maybe we should just start with probability, and I can, I guess, turn it over to Al to define what probability is, and then maybe any other things that you think are relevant.
Yeah, I would distinguish two things. First, there's just the mathematics of probability, and the standard way of thinking about probability formally is in terms of Kolmogorov's axioms, and that basically says probability, it's a real valued quantity. It takes a minimum value of 0, it takes a maximal value of 1, and it adds in a certain way. And now there's an issue of the so-called interpretation of this mathematical thing, this thing that we write with the letter P. But what does this P mean? And there are three, I would say, main ways of thinking about probability. One is, let's call it objective chance. It's something out there in the world. You know, radium atoms decay with a certain probability over a given time. And that has nothing to do with what anyone thinks. It's just a property out there in the world of this radium atom. Then there's what we could call subjective probability or credence. And think of that as degree of belief. So, you know, we have beliefs, we have, things we disbelieve, but it seems that really belief is more nuanced. It comes in degrees. Think of them as degrees of confidence. And those are the things that are going to have a lot to do with decision-making and decision theory. And then there's something we might call it evidential probability. So sometimes called degree of confirmation. You know, how much does a piece of evidence support a hypothesis? And again, we can measure that in degrees, and we think of those degrees as probabilities. And then the connection, especially between the last two interpretations, is often thought to be rational agents, their subjective credences, or to be governed by evidential probabilities. And also to make the connection to the first interpretation, which was chance. chance sort of constrains rational credence in a certain way to, this is the so-called principle, but basically you should sort of strive to align your credences with the chances as much as you can. So if you know the chances, you should make them your credences, and generally your credences are your best estimate of the chances. So these three interpretations are sort of intertwined like that.
Awesome. And then another concept that's really important for introducing the wager is utility. So maybe we can turn it over to Liz to talk about like what utility is, and then we'll talk about maybe like expected utility and expected utility theory.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll probably just be really brief. Utility is kind of just a fancy word for value. So it's the measure of how desirable or how good something is. And so, I mean, like sometimes we sort of use money to roughly put utilities on things, although it's not, of course, going to be a perfect measure of utility because money has what people call diminishing marginal utility. So the more of it you get, the less valuable it is. But you can think about, different things are priced differently at the store, in some way roughly reflecting their value. Of course, that's an imperfect measure, but it's just a measure of the value of something is basically what utility is. So yeah, philosophers like to use words like utility to maybe replace more common words like value, but people do talk about expected utility theory and expected value. Those are both words that philosophers use. So we mainly use expected utility in the paper. So I'm guessing we'll probably keep with it and use that language today, but you could substitute it for expected value, and I don't personally think it would make a big philosophical difference. So that's utility. Do you want me to go ahead and say what expected utility is, or do you want to?
Yeah,
okay,
that sounds good.
Yeah, great. So expected utility, sometimes when we're trying to make a decision about what to do, there are certain facts about value that we don't know. So let me give a super basic example. I will give you $10 if I flip a coin and the coin lands heads. Let's just say that's it. That's the example. So in some sense, let's just say the actual value of the $10 is $10, or we could say, assuming you value money linearly or whatever, 10 utility. But then because you only get it if the coin lands heads, let's say it's a fair coin, the expected utility of you accepting my proposal or whatever would be 5. So 0.5 times 10. And so what we generally can do in expected utility theory is do things that are like more complicated than that, but basically let us make decisions rationally when we're uncertain about some of the relevant facts. So do you want me to I can maybe go to like give the more complicated example from the paper, Joe?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, cool. So this is like, now I'll build on that example to make the example slightly more complicated. Okay, so let's say I offer you to play a game and I will flip a coin, similar to our earlier example. If the coin lands heads, like I said, you get $10. But if the coin lands tails, you have to pay me $1. So that's kind of the setup. And then I say, look, you have a choice. You can choose to play the game under the stipulations just given, or you can choose to just pass, not play the game, and then no one gives anyone money. So what is super cool about expected utility theory is you can actually just basically put numbers on everything and then use it to figure out what to do, given this kind of maxim, which is that you should maximize expected utility. So let me explain what that is with this example, and then maybe I'll try to make it more general. The idea is that you say, okay, look, I can take the bet or I cannot take the bet. The two possibilities are heads, the coin lands heads, the coin lands tails. I assign probabilities to those, like Al said, 0.5, 0.5. Those are usually just taken to be subjective probabilities in decision theory. And then you multiply those probabilities by how good it would be if the coin lands heads and I take the bet, the coin lands heads and I don't take the bet, and then the coin lands tails and I take the bet, the coin lands tails and I don't take the bet. Probably if I was really prepared, I would have had a little slide with this up, but hopefully the explanation is enough. So you take the 0.5 and you multiply that by 10, and then you take the 0.5 and you multiply that by -1. And then you add the things you've just multiplied across, and that will give you the expected utility of taking the bet. So 0.5 times 10 is 5. 0.5 times -1 is -0.5. So the expected utility of taking the bet is 4.5. And then that's the hard one. The easy one is just if you don't take the bet, 0.5 times 0, 0, 0.5 times 0 is 0. So the expected utility of not taking the bet is 0. So then we're saying, okay, if you take the bet, your expected utility is 4.5. If you don't take it, your expected utility is 0. There we go. Beautiful. Thank you.
Nice.
That's wonderful. Much easier to see it than for me to just talk through it. So the sort of maximize expected utility would say you ought to take the bet. Let me clarify something though. When you're maximizing expected utility, it's not guaranteed that you're going to make money, that things are going to turn out good for you, because the coin could land tails and then you lose $1, right? But the idea is that if you took this same bet over and over and over again, in the limit, the limit would converge to 4.5. So you would make money overall. And so again, that's why it's expected utility and not actual utility, because it's not guaranteed. If you just play the game one time, you're going to come out richer. But it does say, kind of given the fact that you're uncertain about what the coin will land, you should take the bet. Does that is that clear enough, or should I you guys should add?
No,
whatever.
I think that's really helpful, and I just want for the audience to maybe just like summarize that by using this little thing up here. So when we face a sort of like a decision problem, and you got the setup and the various conditions that you're stipulating, we can draw this little diagram. And on the top, you basically put like the states of the world. So one state of the world is like the coin lands heads. Another state of the world is that the coin lands tails. And we assign a certain probability to those, like a certain, as you were saying, a certain credence that I have that state of the world will obtain. So it's going to be probability of 0.5 to heads, probability of 0.5 to tails. Okay. On the left-hand side, we have the various actions that one can perform. So taking the bet or not taking the bet. And then we assign basically utilities to the sort of outcome that results from the state of the world together with you taking that action. So like, given that you took the action and that state of the world obtains, what's like the utility of that overall combination? And then you put like 10 there. Or so that's 10 for like, if it lands heads and you take the bet, well, then you're going to get the $10. That was given the setup. Similarly, if the coin lands tails and you take the bet, then you're going to lose $1. So it's -1. You pay the dollar to lose. And then we go down, what about the state of the world when it lands heads and you don't take the bet? Well, again, like nothing happens either way. And then when you are trying to calculate the expected utility, you basically multiply down and then you add across, right? So you multiply the probability of heads, which is 0.5, by 10, that gives you 5. You multiply 0.5 by -1, that gives you -0.5. And then you add across to give you 5 plus -0.5, which gives you 4.5. And that is the expected utility of taking the bet. And then the expected utility of not taking the bet is 0. So I hope that at least made sense. Maybe I'll turn it over to Al to clarify anything or add anything that he wants to say.
Oh, no, that's fine. That was good.
Okay, sweet. And then I guess the final thing that we should cover before we get to the wager is like, what exactly does expected utility theory refer to? Maybe one of you can clarify that for the audience.
It's basically just this, I guess, specific decision rule that says when you're faced with a decision problem like this, you should pick the option that maximizes expected utility if there is one, right? So when you've done your calculations, like Joe just talked about, and you look at your expected utilities for each possible action you should take, pick the one that has the highest expected utility. And so it's basically just it's a way to make decisions when you're uncertain, again, that I find really useful. And you can really apply this to anything. I think maybe I told you this before, Joe. I actually did this when we were trying to decide whether to buy car insurance. And I think the fact that my husband's a quite good driver, we ended up getting like the cheaper car insurance than the more expensive one. You have to, it's trickier in some cases because you have to adequately measure the probabilities and utilities. But if you can get a roughly accurate estimate, I think it's actually a really powerful decision-making tool. So that's the answer.
Yeah, and while at least my understanding is that expected utility theory is, for the most part, kind of standard fare in like decision theory, I want to make the audience aware at least that it's not universally accepted. There are sort of like variants. Like I know Laura Buchak here at Princeton has her risk-weighted expected utility theory, where you basically weight some of these calculations by a certain factor, which measures like how risk-averse you are. So I just wanted to mention that to the audience, that there are other sorts of decision rules, and that it's not universally agreed upon that we should follow the decision rule that Liz just articulated.
I might just add to that. It turns out that Pascal's wager is one of the most controversial applications of this decision rule, as we'll probably see in a moment, because it'll involve this infinite utility. And some people think that decision theory just breaks down. It just doesn't even apply in that very case. So it's sort of ironic that this first ever application of decision theory, according to Hájek, for example, Pascal's wager, seems to be a case where it breaks down. Lakatos said that every research program is born refuted, something like that. And it seems we have a confirming instance right here.
Okay, well, that's a great bridge into talking about the wager itself. So maybe Al, if you want to take over and explain what the wager is.
Yep, I'll be glad to. It's important to distinguish Pascal's wager from various so-called proofs of the existence of God. So prior to Pascal, we had people like St. Anselm and Descartes purporting to prove the existence of God, with an ontological argument or a cosmological argument. Now, Pascal won't have a bar of this. Pascal explicitly says reason can decide nothing here. So we're not going to solve that problem of whether God exists or not, but he claims to have solved a different problem. What attitude should you have to God? Or should you believe in God or not? Or as we will soon say, should you wager for God or not? Which is to say, cultivate belief in God. Okay, so let's break down Pascal's wager into, let's say, 3 premises. So the first premise concerns the decision matrix. And we've already seen what a decision matrix looks like. You've got rows, which are the possible options, the actions you can take. Columns are the ways the world could be. Okay, so let's talk about the ways the world could be. Either God exists or God does not exist. Okay, so they're the 2 states, as we'll call them. 2 things you could do. You could either wager for God or wager against God. Okay, and again, for now, we're going to think of that as sort of cultivating belief in God or not. And now here come the utilities. And now we're going to populate the decision matrix. Okay, so the most interesting cell is going to be, the action is wager for God. The state is God exists. So what happens if you wager for God and God exists? According to Pascal, you get infinite reward. Think of that as salvation, okay? And we'll represent that as a utility, which we'll measure with, now I'm doing this sort of figure 8 infinity, figure 8 on its side, like a lemniscate, as we call it. That is going to be one of the crucial problematic points. I'm sure we will discuss that more. Okay, and now let's just move along the matrix. God does not exist. Wager for God. That combination gets some finite value, and it doesn't matter what this finite value is. Let's just call it F1. Now, let's move to the second row. Don't wager for God. F2 is a finite payoff if you don't wager for God and God exists. And then finally, don't wager for God. God does not exist. F3. All right. So to summarize what I've said so far, the interesting cell is wager for God, God exists. That's infinite. All the other cells have finite utility. There's some controversy about whether the God exists and don't wager for God cell should be finite. Maybe it should be negative infinite. Think of that as damnation. That's not our reading of Pascal. Okay. So much for the utility matrix, the decision matrix. Now let's talk about the probabilities. That's premise 2. Rationality requires you to assign positive probability to God's existence. It might be very small for all premise 2 says, but it's bigger than 0. And you can see that's right. On top of the God exists column, you've got this number P That's your probability that God exists. P has to be bigger than 0. And then 3, rationality requires you to maximize expected utility. That's what Liz was talking about before. This is the standard assumption in decision theory, and I'm sure we will talk more about that. Those are the premises. Allegedly, it follows the conclusion: rationality requires you to wager for God. Okay, that's going to be the upshot of Pascal's reasoning. And the conclusion does seem to follow from the premises, and here we've got it on the slide. Let's just calculate the expected utilities. For a start, for wager for God, okay, so as Liz explained, you multiply probability by utility and you add across the different states. Okay, so the first column, you've got probability P times infinity. Okay, second column, you've got the probability 1 minus P times F1. Add them up, you get infinity. And premise 2 does play a role here, as we've said, because P times infinity is still infinity if P is positive. If P equals 0, that's not the case. Then you get 0. What about don't wager for God? Just do the same thing. P times F2 plus 1 minus P times F3. It's something finite plus something finite, which equals something finite. Let's call it F4. Okay. And now we appeal to premise 3. We want to maximize expected utility. Well, infinity is bigger than F4. So it seems like we're done. Rationality requires you to wager for God. That's how you maximize expected utility. Okay, so that is Pascal's wager as it's usually understood, at least in modern parlance. And I might just say, in the Pensée, Pascal actually gives several what you might call wagers. He has a couple of dominance arguments. We probably won't get into that much today, but the main argument, the one that is usually called Pascal's wager, is this expected utility argument, which I've just gone through.
Awesome. And then Liz, I don't know if you wanted to add anything before we get into the section where we talk about maybe some popular objections and then maybe some areas of disagreement between you guys.
No, I mean, I think that's great. I think anything I would add will probably come later. And I will say, like, this is like a simpler formulation of the wager. And so people that are, maybe modern defenders of the wager probably will want to make things a little bit more complex in various ways. But I think it's really useful to start here and kind of see the basics before we get into additional complexities. I mean, like, one question is like, what does it mean to wager for God? Like, that's a huge issue we can talk about. And yeah, we'll get into some objections soon, so I think we'll cover a lot of it. So
yeah, and for some of those like complexities about like what does it mean to wager for God, and maybe we can actually somehow get these versions so that instead of putting a little infinity here, we actually have some very, very, very high but finite number. I'll put some resources in the description to some of both of your guys' work that explore some of those details. So for you guys who are curious, you can click down in the description and find work from our guests. Okay, so let's move on to, yes, just some objections to the wager. And maybe we can start with the many gods objection and the mixed strategies objection. Maybe that's a good place to start. And I don't know which one of you guys I should turn it over to. So I'll just leave that open. I'll leave it open, whichever one of you wants to pick.
Liz, do the many gods?
I'll do many gods and you could do mixed strategies. Does that sound good? Okay, great. So the first, and in some ways it's good to do this first because when you introduce the wager in Philosophy 101, a lot of people bring this worry up. It's like a common thing I get from students, which is, well, you've made this decision matrix, but in some sense it's overly simplistic because you've really just considered wager for God and don't wager for God. And even saying we have a stipulation about what wagering means, there's not just one God to wager for, right? There's different religions and they stipulate different kinds of gods. And not all religions say, well, if you just are some kind of bare theist, you will have salvation, or you will have whatever that, utility sign represents. It's not guaranteed you're going to get that just because you sort of wager for God in some generic sense. So which religion of the many religions should we pick? That's maybe a way to put it as a question, but I think you can make it even more complicated. We don't have a visual representation of this, but in the paper, we don't have visual representation of this in the paper, but I can kind of hopefully try to explain it. So if you have, like, let's just say you have wager for the Christian God, and then you add wager for the Muslim God, what's going to end up happening is then you'll probably want to add, Christianity is true, Islam is true, and then you might want to add additional religions beyond that as well. So the decision tree is just going to get more complicated, many more columns, many more rows, but you're also maybe even worse, going to have multiple expected values that are all infinite, right? Because if you wager on Christianity and the Christian God exists, it'll be infinite. Then we'll have to say, okay, what if you wager on Christianity, but Islam turns out to be true? Is that a finite value? Is that a negative infinity? And then our expected value is infinity minus infinity. That's, what do we do with that? And then this really interesting move is made by Sober and Mogan, and they say, well, look, suppose there's a new religion, and on this religion, it's the atheist loving God, right? So this God sends all atheists to heaven and all theists to hell. And so you might think, well, with the many gods objection, we should at least practice some religion, but that's not even clear, right? Because if you add, okay, atheist loving God exists, and then wager on the atheist loving God to one of your columns and rows, atheism is going to turn out to have this same complicated expected value, and it's going to look like pretty much on a par with any of the more maybe mainstream religions. And so really the many gods objection makes things really complicated. We talked about the decision rule, maximize expected value or maximize expected utility, pick the option that does if there is one. But in this case, it's not even clear that there's an option that would maximize expected value, at least based on the way we were sort of calculating expected value before. So it seems like the wager kind of collapses. Like, you could be a theist, you could be a Muslim, you could be a Christian, you could be an atheist, and it doesn't really distinguish between any of those options.
Pascal said that reason can decide nothing here. And this maybe exposes him, especially to this many gods objection. Well, if reason can decide nothing, it seems that all of these alternative gods are live possibilities, and we should be taking them seriously. And remember, we've represented the utility of salvation with that lemniscate infinity. And that, I think, is really making the many gods objection pretty potent, because now it seems even if you don't have the same probability for these rival gods, still you just multiply the probability that a given god exists by that infinity, and you get your infinity back. Now, one move we could make, for example, Schlesinger suggests this is we should use probability as a tiebreaker, so to speak. So some gods seem to be more probable than others. Like maybe the Mugen and Sober God, even though it's somehow possible, maybe you'd say it's less probable than, say, the God of Christianity or the God of Islam. Okay, so we might then use probability as a tiebreaker, and now we should wager for the God that's the most probable, to put it simply. And now, to be sure, this was not something that Pascal himself said. This is probably going to be a bit of a recurring theme. How faithful should we be to the text of Pascal's Pensées, and how much should we be trying to help the wager out and improve it? So if we just we spot Pascal this extra premise about probability being a tiebreaker, then it seems maybe we could make a bit of progress on the many gods objection. Also, and I'm sure this will come up some more soon, again, instead of using that figure 8 infinity, if we have some sort of nuanced infinity and we'll probably talk about ways of doing that, for example, surreal numbers. Then again, you won't just have everything collapsing to infinity, for every rival god. You'll start to make distinctions between the expected utilities. They'll still involve infinite quantities, but depending what you multiply them by, it'll make a difference. And that might also make some progress, but it'll get complicated, So now the matrix is not that simple 2 by 2 matrix that we've been representing Pascal's wager with. It'll be this rather complicated thing, many rows, different gods you could wager for, many columns, different gods existing, different entries in the cells, and now you just have to do the math.
Not only does it get complicated, but it also becomes less clearly a purely pragmatic argument for God's existence, because you're thinking both about this pragmatic, maximize expected value stuff, but also about what is the probability of these various religions or states of the world or the atheist loving God. And so you will need to combine the wager argument with some kind of the more pure evidence and argumentation when you're comparing probabilities of these various religions. So, in my view, these are things worth trying to sort through, but I completely acknowledge it gets much more complicated and less pure in some sense. It's not a purely pragmatic argument anymore.
Yeah, good. And again, Pascal said reason can decide nothing here, but maybe it's not just pure reason that's deciding. Again, to be fair to Pascal, he's reacting to St. Anselm and Descartes, who alleged to give these a priori proofs of the existence of God. But really, our situation's a bit different. We can look at the world, we can look at the evidence, as Liz said, for various hypotheses about God, and that'll make a difference, presumably, to rational credences. Yeah,
absolutely. And one way you can go too is just say, put your credences in whatever they happen to be. I'm not telling you what credences to have, but input them in this way. And then at least for some people, I mean, maybe it wouldn't be the strong claim like all rational agents must wager, but for some people, given their credences, it could have the result they should wager. So I don't think you actually have to combine it with arguments that this religion is more probable or less probable. You could just say, put in your credences or something. But yeah, there's different ways you could go there.
Maybe we should now go on to the mixed strategy objection, and then or mixed strategies, and then maybe after that we'll then talk about like whether we'll just dig into more details about this infinite reward and like whether that makes sense. So I'll turn over to Al to talk about mixed strategies.
Okay, good. Okay, so far we were thinking about the columns in the decision matrix. There are more gods to worry about than just, God exists, God does not exist, the 2 columns. Now, let's think more about the rows. These are the things you could do. So again, Pascal is saying you should wager for God. That maximizes expected utility, as we say on Pascal's behalf. But I think it's more complicated than that. And that the punchline here is going to be that Pascal's wager is invalid. So let's grant him his premises, grant him the decision matrix, and in particular that figure 8 infinity for salvation's utility, grant him positive probability for God's existence, grant him maximize expected utility, decision theory. I say it doesn't follow from those premises that rationality requires you to wager for God. Here's why. First, just consider an alternative strategy. This is not what Pascal is recommending, okay? Toss a coin. Heads, you wager for God. Tails, you don't, all right? Now, with probability half, the coin lands heads, okay? And now we know how to do the math, right? You multiply probability by utility and you keep adding, okay? Half times infinity is infinity, okay? And now in our expectation calculation, we add some finite stuff, but that won't matter. We've got infinity as the expected value for this, what I'll call a mixed strategy, okay? Using the coin toss to determine whether I'll wager for God or not, okay? So the expectation is infinity, and that is just as good as outright wagering for God as far as expected value goes, expected utility goes, all right? And now you see the trick, but let's just do it a couple more times. All right, I wait to see whether I win the lottery next week. Let's say it's a 1 in a billion chance that I win the lottery next week. Okay. I wager for God if and only if I win. Okay. 1 in a billion times infinity equals infinity. Okay. Now do the expected value calculation. You get infinity for this mixed strategy, even though this one has it very unlikely that I'll end up wagering for God, but there's still some probability, 1 in a billion. Okay. And it can get crazier still. I wait to see whether a meteor quantum tunnels through the side of a mountain or not. I don't know, one in a Googleplex probability that it does, but that's positive. Now multiply that positive probability by infinity and you get infinity again, all right? And now the worry starts to become, it seems that pretty much whatever I do, there's some positive probability that I'll wind up wagering for God. So maybe I don't want to think about the wager at all. Maybe I just want to go have a beer. But there's some positive probability that while I'm having the beer, I will wind up wagering for God. So you could think of having a beer as kind of a mixed strategy between wagering and wagering against God. Okay? Multiply the probability that I wind up wagering for God by infinity, you get infinity again for having a beer. Okay, so you see where this is going. It's starting to look like whatever I do, there's some probability that I will wind up wagering for God. Multiply that probability by infinity, you get an expected value of infinity back. And that's just as good as outright wagering for God by expected utility lights, which were the lights that we were talking about in our presentation of the wager. Okay, so the punchline here, well, first punchline is that the argument is invalid because I've given an alternative strategy, in fact, many, to wagering for God that seems to fare just as well by the lights of expected utility theory. Okay, and in fact, it's sort of worse than that. It's not just that there was some alternative, but it seems like whatever you do is just as good by the lights of expected utility theory. Now, remember earlier we said that maybe we should add some further a further assumption, something about maximizing probability. That'll be relevant here again. But anyway, as far as just the formal point goes, Pascal's wager as we presented it is invalid because there are these mixed strategies that do just as well as far as expected utility goes. Okay, so that's the mixed strategy objection, which I find one of the strongest objections, at least to that wager as originally presented.
Who said that, like, oh, now we just have this thing that almost anything you do has infinite expected utility? That's a blessing from God. So we don't even need the wager anymore. We have this proof of God. Someone said that. I don't know if it was done. I don't remember. Anyway, I thought that was funny.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Leibniz said that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah, there you go.
He certainly didn't have that in mind. It wasn't that easy.
A new route to Leibnizian value of the world. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I don't know, Liz, if you had anything to add to Al's sort of stuff there.
No, that's great. I mean, I'll just say, I mean, Al kind of already said this at the end, but once you get this probability as a tiebreaker kind of thing going, I do think it can give you a reason to privilege the pure strategy or strategies over the mixed strategies. But there's other things that come along with it as well. And it's similar in some ways to the many gods thing. You're going to have complications in how you do the math. You're going to have a more complicated decision tree. Well, I don't know. Al has a nice paper where he kind of gives a dilemma. Would you want to maybe expand on that dilemma a little bit, Al?
Yeah, I like to put this in the form of a dilemma. So remember, so far we've attributed to Pascal this figure eight infinity, which has this unfortunate, let's call it absorption property, that you multiply it by anything positive and you get the same thing back. Infinity times p equals infinity for any positive p. So that seems fatal as far as these expected utility calculations go. Now you might try to give some more nuanced representation of infinity. And there are various ways to do this. There's so-called surreal numbers, where you'll have infinite numbers with names like omega, but now multiplying omega by some probability like a half or 1 in a billion or 1 in a googolplex will make a difference. Okay, it's not true that half times omega equals omega, the way it was true that half times figure 8 infinity equals infinity. Okay, so far so good. This seems like a good reply to the mixed strategies objection. And by the way, probably a good reply to the many gods objection too. Now you are making subtle distinctions among the infinities. Okay, but now, at least in my Waging War on Pascal's wager paper, I pose the following dilemma. Now, Pascal thought that salvation was the best possible thing, and he said that unity added to infinity adds nothing to it. So basically, he's stating this absorption property for addition. He's saying that infinity plus 1 equals infinity. And you could see why he might want to say that, because salvation is supposed to be the best possible thing. It doesn't get better if you add $1 to it, for example, all right? Okay, but now if you have one of these more nuanced infinities, like say omega, adding 1 makes a difference. Like adding $1 to omega in utility is better than omega itself. There's another way of reformulating the wager we might talk more about later. If the infinite stuff's getting too hard, just imagine a really big finite number that represents the utility of salvation. Okay, call it big F, F for finite. Okay, F plus 1 is better than F. So F has the nice property that if you halve it, you get something smaller. Okay, or if you multiply it by a billionth or a googolplexth, you get something smaller still. That's good for answering the mixed strategies objection. But now there's what seems like a problem, that salvation is not the best possible thing. It's F, but God could have made it F plus 1 or 2F, okay, or a million F. Okay, so now just to summarize the dilemma, either you've got the mixed strategies objection really kicking in, all of these alternative strategies are equally good, or salvation is no longer the best possible thing. Adding 1 to it or doubling it or whatever would have made it better. So on the second horn, we're no longer faithful to what Pascal, the guy, said in the Pensée. We're disagreeing with unity added to infinity adds nothing to it. No, it makes a difference. And now we get into an interesting issue. What are we doing? Pascal scholarship, or are we just trying to give the wager its best shot? But anyway, that's the dilemma that I think Liz was talking about.
Yeah, and I will say too, even setting aside, like, let's just say we'll set aside the historical stuff to try to get the strongest version of the wager possible. I mean, it's not 100% clear to me that there's still not a bullet to bite in general, because there's something theologically intuitive about wanting to maintain that salvation is the best thing possible. So maybe I'll mention 2 things you might say in response to that, and then see what you think, Al. So the first is this. So reasoning about infinities is hard and complicated, and maybe we do need to bring in something like surreal numbers or something in order to distinguish between various kinds of infinities and to get out of mixed strategies and many gods. So in order to reason about infinities, we have to bring in these fancy mathematical tools. But maybe those are kind of just tools. Like, maybe what they're doing is they're representing things that are technically represented as better than salvation, but we're really just using them to kind of do this decision problem. And there's not like metaphysical things in reality that correspond to, to these values in our decision table. So that's maybe one way The other thing, and we talked about this a little bit already, Al, but I thought it was an interesting idea as well. On certain ways of representing these infinities, it's going to be like infinities all the way up, kind of like, turtles all the way down, or something like that. There might not be a best thing possible, right? There's not one best infinity possibly. And we talked about this idea that, well, maybe if there's not a best thing possible for salvation to correspond to, then it's okay for God to do something like satisfy thing. And there's some interesting responses. This parallels what some people say in response to the problem of evil. We talked about Leibniz a second ago. So some people say, look, there's no best possible world. There's just this range of worlds that go from better to worse, and God can pick one that's good enough, since there's not a best possible world, and God did pick one with some evil, but it was good enough, so it's like a response to the problem of evil. So maybe this in some ways parallels that. There's no one best infinity for salvation to correspond to, so God picks one that's good enough. So do you have thoughts about either of those?
Yeah, good. They're both good replies. The first one was, our representation in this decision theory of the utility of salvation, we're using a certain mathematical tool. The way I put it is, well, but let's not reify that. Just the mere fact that our mathematics allows us to state these various infinities doesn't mean we should sort of project that onto God as his genuine options.
Yeah.
So that's a good point, and that's. Then that gets us to the second point, which was something like, look, not even God can do the logically impossible. He can't, for example, maximize something that has no maximum. So yeah. Suppose you set God the task, God, choose the greatest positive integer. Well, he can't do that because that there is none. Okay, and that's not some limitation on God. You've given him a logically impossible task description. Okay, so you might say it's something similar in the case of these ever better infinities. If the charge against God is, God, you should pick the highest one. Well, he can't do that, but that's because there is no highest one. So of course he can't do the impossible. Okay, I'm reminded, by the way, there are a number of paradoxes sort of in the vicinity. Like there's the so-called ever better wine paradox of Pollock. You've got this bottle of wine that ages really well, and the longer you leave it, the later you open it, the better it'll taste better. Okay, so the paradox is, when do you open it? All right, and the thought is, well, there's a sense in which whenever you open it, it's too soon, because gosh, a day later it would be noticeably better, we're imagining. Okay, but the worst choice is never to open it. Okay, so what you do is, as Liz was saying, I guess you satisfy. So you choose some time that you think is long enough, it's finite, and you just open it then. Now, in some sense, you could have done better by waiting another day, but you certainly don't want to keep on delaying it and never open it. That's the worst option. So you might say that the situation for God is a little bit like the ever better wine, that there are ever better prospects of salvation, I suppose, in some sense, mathematically at least. But it's not like God could maximize among them.
Yeah, if I could add in something, one of my potential worries for that kind of move, and the second reply that Liz suggested, and you can feel free to tell me if this is confused, that's okay. But like you're proposing a particular God, and this God is affording us, let's say, a particular rank of infinity reward for wagering on that God. But it seems like whatever rank you pick, I can come up with a different God hypothesis, God star. And this God star offers a higher rank of infinity or whatever, like a higher order. And even if my God is far less probable than yours, so even if yours is like 0.3 probability and mine is 0.1, or even mine is 0.00000001, when you multiply my 0.000001 by the higher rank of infinity, you still get out the higher rank of infinity, and you have the lower rank of infinity. So my expected utility, or the expected utility of wagering on my God, is higher than yours. So it seems like any God that you propose, there's a different God that we should be wagering on, and so we shouldn't be and which would be maximizing expected utility by wagering on that god. So it seems like for any particular god that you choose, we shouldn't wager on that particular god.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. We've called this before. I don't know how common this is, but we've called this the super religion objection. So give me any religion, I can make a super religion that maximizes expected value more than your religion. I mean, I think it's a nice argument. I mean, yeah. Al, do you want to say anything first? I mean, I have a thought to share, but
No, you go. That's right.
Yeah. I mean, one thing you could say, this is kind of separate from the two responses I just gave, but that you shouldn't be too strong when you're committing to represent like Christianity or Islam or whatever, a traditional religion in a certain way in a decision table. So you might just kind of, for the sake of doing the decision problem, represent the value of Christianity with some surreal number. But like, if you take that too literally, these super religions start coming in and destroying things. And so you shouldn't necessarily stipulate the value of Christianity as like one surreal number over another or something like that. Another way of putting it is that like it's not specific over utilities. I mean, it gets into complications though, right? Because then it's like, how do you do the math? And so I'm not totally clear this is going to solve it, but I do think I would, for the sake of this, just want to be careful to make this a metaphysical claim, like this is the exact value of salvation on the Christian story or something, because I don't think there's really a reason to assign that one infinity over another. I'm not saying that'll solve everything, but that's an off-the-cuff thought.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe next we can get on to at least Pascal's mugging, at least briefly, because I think it's kind of fun. Maybe I'll turn it over to Al. Al, are you cool with explaining that?
Well, actually, Liz, how about you start,
Sure.
And then I'll. There's a certain point where I will want to chime in, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Great. Okay. So Pascal's wager, just to refresh, the idea is this. There's different formulations of it, of course, but even if you have a very, very, very small, very, very low credence or assign a low probability to the existence of God, because there's this very good value of salvation, you should potentially give up some finite goods in order to wager on God, maybe going to church, maybe tithing, maybe whatever, to get this value of salvation, right? So Pascal's mugging is kind of meant to parry Pascal's wager, and there's basically a story that is kind of fun. I like it, Joe. And you can actually, like, if you're listening to this and you're interested in this, just go look at Nick Bostrom's paper. It's an analysis. I think you can just go download it on Phil Papers, and it's a nice little dialogue. And it's like, I think it's like 5 pages or less. It's pretty short, so you should just read it. But I'll tell you what the basic story is. So Pascal, let's say Pascal's walking down a dark alley late at night, and a mugger jumps out and says, "Pascal, give me your wallet." And then Pascal's like, "Why should I give you my wallet? Like, you're pretty puny and you don't have any weapons on you." And the mugger's like, "I got this. I know this guy. This guy's Pascal." He says, "If you hand me your wallet, I will perform magic, and that will give you an extra 10 Googleplex happy days of life," or something, right? I mean, you can make it a really, really big number. Bostrom specifically makes it a big finite number to avoid these complications of infinities we were just talking about, but you could even make it an infinite number if you wanted. So different ways of going there. And so Pascal's like, "Okay, look, you know, there's some money in my wallet. I would hate to lose that money. My credence that the mugger is telling the truth is extremely low, but it's not zero. There's some chance that this person actually does magic and can actually give me these Googleplex days of happy life. And so I do this expected utility calculation, and I multiply this very, 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 very low credence time this, you know, a Googleplex happy days utility, and it ends up being that Pascal is rationally required to hand over his wallet." And so I think, like, the idea is that, look, there are cases where it seems irrational to take this tiny, tiny chance at this really, really good thing, to give up some finite good for that, even though, according to expected utility theory, you should. And so then some people say, well, look, in the same way this is a problem, in the Pascal's mugging case. It's also a problem in the Pascal's wager case. Al had kind of a fun way of taking Pascal's mugging even further. Did you want to go with? Yeah, you should go for that, Al.
Yeah. So the way, good, thanks. So the way I would say it, look, never mind the mugger in Bostrom's story. Just pick a random person in the street, or maybe you're at a big football game. Just pick a random person in the crowd who has not interacted with you at all. Well, maybe there's still some probability that they're like what Bostrom's mugger claims in the Bostrom story. You know, this random person, maybe if you give them your wallet just voluntarily, they will shower huge wealth upon you. Okay. Look, extremely unlikely, but there's some positive probability for that. So maybe you should just go to a random person. They don't even say anything to you, and you just hand over your wallet, and there's some positive probability that they will do what Bostrom's mugger claims to do. Now, that's if you like, it's like a many muggers objection. And there's also going to be a parallel to the Mugen and Sober, you know, the perverse God who rewards the non-believers and who punishes the believers. Yeah, I mean, maybe this random person will greatly reward you if you don't hand over your wallet, and will torture you if you do hand over your wallet, okay? So now the calculations are going to get much more complicated. This is very similar to the many gods objection, all right? And so there's no saying how the math's going to work out once you fill in all of the cells in this complicated decision matrix.
Yeah. So I'll say maybe briefly, some people, what they do is they say, well, look, the reason things have gone wrong in the mugging case is that when we have these extremely low probabilities, like this guy comes out in a dark alley, he clearly just wants your money, he claims he can perform magic, like this isn't Harry Potter, dude, like just round that down to zero, you know? So yes, maybe you should technically give it a non-zero credence, but for all practical purposes in decision theory, just make it a zero. So different people have proposed versions of this principle, and we talk about it a little bit more detail in the paper. But what ends up happening is that, well, in some cases, it seems like you should round down to zero, and maybe in some cases, it seems like you shouldn't. So that's one thing. It's like, how do we distinguish the cases correctly? But also, rounding to zero actually leads to like a bunch of technical problems. It actually makes you susceptible to Dutch books. So we cite a paper that explains that in more detail. So basically you could lose money in a series of bets, which for a lot of people working in decision theory, that's like a paradigm case of irrationality. I don't know, Al, was there any other, like, basically it's just a very complicated debate, and it's not really clear that rounding down to zero is going to be the right way to respond here, even though there's something that seems really intuitive about that.
That's right. And also, so what exactly is the threshold? So when is a probability small enough that you can rationally ignore it? It seems arbitrary to say, well, it's exactly here as it might be, you know, 1 in a trillion. That's the magic number where suddenly you can treat that as zero. There will be Sorites-related problems here too. So absolutely. Yes, I think it's an interesting dilemma. On the one hand, if you take seriously these small probabilities, you have this sometimes called fanaticism, that you will make seemingly irrational choices because you're so fixated on huge rewards with small probabilities, and Pascal's mugging, it seems to bring that out. On the other hand, it doesn't seem principled to just zero out a probability that's genuinely positive. Now, to be fair, there are people who make a strong case for this. For example, Nick Smith. I've also replied to Nick Smith that I don't think it's so easy just to neglect these small probabilities. But this is quite a lively debate. And as I say, it's quite related to fanaticism, which in turn is a live debate in the effective altruism community and long-termism about, you know, what we should do. So this is quite a flourishing area.
Yeah, Pascal's wager in this area in general have really interesting connections to effective altruism, because they're saying in the good that we do, in this altruistic good that we do, we should consider expected value, not just actual value. So they're willing to put lots of resources and effort into things like, maybe a low probability nuclear war, or like low probability runaway AI, or those kinds of things. And I mean, I love effector altruism. I think it's awesome. But again, this question is like, when do we round down to zero and when do we not? I would hate for like us to commit to some principle that means a lot of these things that I think these people are rightfully working on, they shouldn't be working on. So, and I'll say too, just maybe bringing it back to Pascal's wager, one more quick thing that we do briefly mention in the paper. Even if you do get some kind of plausible principle that tells you when a probability is just so far-fetched or outlandish that you should make it zero, it's not clear that this is gonna at least apply to a lot of potential people that might be wagering, because that's an extraordinary low probability. It's not like this thing that there's like these been live like philosophical debates about for like thousands of years. It's not a thing that people seem to rationally disagree on. Like most people are going to see the mugger in the alleyway and be like, dude, this guy's crazy, right? And so it's not clear that, like, I'm not saying this is a universal sociological claim or anything, but it's not clear that people's probabilities for the existence of God is going to be this negligible. It's not. So that might be like one structural difference between Pascal's mugging and then like people's actual credences about God.
Yeah, so it's nice that we were able to touch on at least some of those worries about probability that you guys talked about in your paper. I do, though, want to get onto some other difficulties. So one that you mentioned, Liz, before going live is wagering even possible? So I'll turn it over to you to just kind of articulate the general. I mean, it's really a family of worries, but I'll turn it over to you to articulate that. And maybe we can discuss that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay. Every time I think we're going back to this, we're talking about some feature of the original argument, which is great, actually. So remember, in the original argument, we had wager for God and not wager for God. And so this really brings up the question, well, what does it mean for to wager for God? And I think a lot of people naturally will make that to be something about belief. Maybe just crudely, we could say believe in God, not believe in God. Let's just say wagering is believing in God. Okay. If we do that, I think things do get tricky, right? Because what we're doing, and this is what Al said when he like just introduced Pascal's wager at the very beginning, right? We're not giving you positive evidence that God exists. If we did, then it seems easier to form a belief on that basis. But no, we're saying like, look at this kind of cost-benefit decision theoretic analysis. Given that, like the costs, like the benefits of believing God are way better than the costs, so you should believe in God. But it's really hard to form beliefs on that basis. So a common thing that people, example people give in what's called doxastic voluntarism or involuntarism literature, that's the doxastic means just related to belief. Voluntarism, do we have voluntary control? And they'll say, look, let's say I gave you $1 million to believe 1 + 1 = 3. Even if you're like, I actually don't care at all about the mathematical belief and I really just need the money, I really prefer the money, you couldn't believe it, right? It's just this belief is just that beliefs happen to you. You sort of see that it's false, that 1 + 1 = 3, and so you disbelieve it, and you can't bring yourself to believe that even if you want the money more. And so the worry is that wagering, especially if you make wagering about belief, it's just not even something that you can do. It's not possible to do. And then if ought implies can, then you shouldn't wager because you cannot, so you ought not. So that's the worry, is that taking Pascal's wager is impossible.
Yeah, Al, do you have any sort of thoughts on this?
Yeah, good. There's what you might call doxastic voluntarism, I think, as Liz calls it. So this is whether you can form a belief in something. And for a start, I would say, look, the cases like 1 + 1 = 3, they're special cases where like the evidence is so decisive, and also you're starting in a case in a state of like extreme disbelief, and so of course it's very hard to switch to a belief. I think maybe more interesting are cases where you're starting in a state of agnosticism, and now we ask, is it possible as an act of the will to switch from agnosticism to belief? Now, it seems that at least some people think that agnosticism is somewhat under your voluntary control. Like judges in legal cases instruct juries, don't form any opinions until you've heard all the evidence, suggesting that this is something under their control, right? That's a kind of voluntarism. And maybe it's easier to switch from agnosticism to outright belief. And Liz, by the way, has also talked about permissivism, and this may be relevant here in a minute too. But maybe the key point I want to then emphasize is, remember the way we formulated Pascal's wager was not in terms of belief. It wasn't believe in God or not. It was wager for God or not. As I put it earlier, cultivate, go through the steps that tend to lead to belief. And that's an action that surely is under your voluntary control. Pascal says, go to mass, take the holy water and so on, hang out with believers, okay? Yeah. And there's no issue about voluntarism there. I mean, of course you can do these things. And if that's really what the relevant option is in Pascal's wager, well, there's just no problem there. There's no issue about that being impossible or beyond your control.
Yeah, good. Why don't we keep playing the roles where you defend and I object? So let me object to that now. So it's like, let's say we just set belief aside, and then we can make the wager about trying to cultivate belief, or making a commitment to believe, or even just making a commitment to pursue God, or whatever it is, a religious commitment of some kind. You might worry this leads to possibly a second objection. I've called this the irrationality objection. And so the thought is, look, even if taking Pascal's wager is something you can do because it's just actions that you take, or you take holy water, or you go hang out with certain people or whatever, is it telling us to do something that kind of looks like engaging in confirmation bias, where we're just exposing ourselves to one side of the evidence and ignoring all the other evidence? And if so, maybe it's rational from the perspective of decision theory, but maybe not rational from maybe the perspective of epistemology that's more concerned with getting at truth and avoiding error. So, I think that is a worry, possibly, depending on what exactly you say. I mean, maybe there's ways of formulating wager for God that don't run into this, but there are some ways of formulating it. The strong, just like do everything you can to pursue belief and ignore all dissenting evidence, you might worry about.
Yeah, good. I had that exact worry
cool
about.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, here's one way of making belief a matter of the will. This is a kind of voluntarist picture. Well, as an act of the will, you can go and get evidence that favors this thing that you want to believe. And this is exactly what Pascal seems to be recommending. Go on this course of evidence gathering. But as Liz says, it seems to be biased evidence gathering. Pascal's not advising at the end of the Pensée, look, go talk to believers, but also talk to disbelievers. He's not saying, attend mass, but also attend, atheist rallies or something. No, the worry is there's a sort of confirmation bias that you're only looking at a certain kind of evidence while screening out, ignoring the rest. This is still a kind of voluntarist might still say, look, I will be honest. I will look at the full, scope of evidence, the full diverse range of evidence. And it could well turn out that I wind up believing on the basis of that, because maybe that evidence overall will tip me that way. And that is a kind of way of cultivating belief if things turn out that way.
Yeah.
But they may not.
Here's a second option that's related to the permissivism thing. So let's say you go on this quest, you're trying to find out the truth, you're not at least intentionally engaging in confirmation bias, but you're really looking at both sides, and you kind of find the evidence wanting. I mean, Pascal even says, maybe this is a place where evidence is impoverished and reason can't decide. And you're like, look, I see these theists, they seem rational, they seem to have arguments, The arguments aren't all complete trash, even though they're very controversial and whatever. But then we have the problem of evil and hiddenness, and that's an issue too. And really, I don't know, like, is the evidence just going to solve it? Like, maybe not. And maybe this will be person dependent, depends on your epistemic standards, depends on your priors, whatever, right? But if you get to the place where you find the evidence wanting, maybe something like the wager could break that tie for you and say, well, look, I could be rational to be a theist, I could be rational to be agnostic, I could be rational to be an atheist. I've gathered all this evidence. I haven't determined it points one decisive way. And so because the evidence doesn't force one attitude on me, I'm going to do the prudential thing and take the wager. And it's not obvious to me that doing that is epistemically irrational, because doing that would be taking, I mean, if you agree that I've stipulated that given some complicated evidence, any of those three belief attitudes could be rational, it's taking an attitude that's already one of the rational explanations of your evidence. So that's one way to go. I mean, I guess it relies on this possibly controversial idea that the evidence regarding theism is complicated and rationalizes multiple responses. Not everyone likes permissivism, but that's a possibility, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that just so before we get into the final thing about St. Petersburg Paradox, I just wanted to at least raise one more potential thing that we should, or objection that we should talk about. And it's just like, does it seem impious to kind of believe in God or commit to God on this sort of basis? Is it somehow not really I don't even know what to say. Like, is it really respecting God? Is this something that God would really appreciate? It's like, oh, I went through this wager and I was like, oh, this would be in my self-interest to get the infinite reward. Maybe I should cultivate all these activities and, like, hang out with the religious people and whatnot. That doesn't seem to be something that God would appreciate, would it? So anyway, that's the sort of objection. And so then, anyway, I'll just turn it over to you. Maybe, Liz, you can articulate the objection in better detail. So
I have thoughts, but do you want to say anything, Al? I mean,
no, I think that you're
okay, yeah. So here's kind of my response to this worry. And it's funny, William James makes a version of this worry in response to Pascal and says, look, if someone's just taking mass and holy water on the basis of a brute calculation like this, God is not going to give them salvation, but God's going to, damn them, or maybe it's a finite thing or whatever. I don't know that he actually says, but the point is that you can't actually count on that infinity being there, James is saying, because this is like a bad reason to make a religious commitment, or there's something impious or unvirtuous about this. So interesting that William James kind of says this about Pascal, even though William James makes his own pseudo wager thing. So anyway, I mean, my kind of response is partially concessive. And I say, I think there are ways of taking the wager that might look unvirtuous or like seem like, oh, all I care about is salvation. I'm just going to do this brute calculation and then make a religious commitment on the basis of that. But one thing is that, like, you can start off in something, like, if you've ever watched Hallmark movies, you'll know this, like, start off on something for like a bad reason, like the person that like dates the person just because, like, I don't know, they like their friend, or just, some bad, they're rich, whatever it is, right? But then they end up like truly actually falling in love at the end of the movie, right? Like the bad Hallmark movie, right? Like half of them are like this, right? And so maybe like you start off making a religious commitment for like a bad or impious reason, but you actually end up in something like a genuine religious commitment. So I think that's one possibility. But I think there's another possibility, which is that you actually say, look, there's some positive probability that there's like this all-powerful, all-good creator. Maybe on some religious traditions, this creator even like cares about me or wants to have a relationship with me or wants to be someone who I say prayers to. And I'm not at all convinced that there's a God. I think that the verdict is definitely out on that, but there's some chance it's true. And because of how good it would be to have a religious commitment and have a connection to this creator, I'm going to take a chance and I'm going to do my best to make a commitment to God, or make a commitment to seek out evidence for God, or, however you want to fill wagering in, because of how good it would be if God existed and I did kind of make this commitment. So I think I have a paper on this. It's called faithfully taking Pascal's wager. And I spell this out in a lot more detail in there. I won't go into it here, but I take like this common account of religious faith, and I argue that there are ways of taking the wager in which you fulfill all the conditions for faith. So I think that's kind of cool. You can check that paper out for more, but that's my basic response.
All right, so maybe now for the final thing, we could just talk about the connection between Pascal's wager and the St. Petersburg paradox or problem. So maybe I'll turn it over to Al just
Yep.
to take us through that.
Yeah, maybe I should begin by laying out the St. Petersburg paradox. Okay.
Absolutely.
This is a classic problem for decision theory, for expected utility theory. So here's the game. We're going to toss a fair coin until it lands heads for the first time. And the longer it takes, the better for you, because there'll be exponentially growing payoffs according to how long it takes. So let's suppose the coin lands heads immediately, and that happens with probability half. I'll give you $2, okay? Now, suppose we have to wait until the second toss for the first heads. So it's tails, then heads, okay? In that case, I'll give you $4, and that happens with probability a quarter, okay? Or maybe it'll take 3 tosses for the first heads, okay? Tails, tails, heads, and that happens with probability an eighth. I will give you $8 in that case. And in general, I will give you 2 to the n dollars if it takes n trials for the first heads, okay? Now, let's suppose for now that utility just goes by the face value of the money, it just goes by the dollar amount, okay? So now, as usual, we multiply the utility by the probability, and then we add across all of the possibilities. So we've got half times 2 plus a quarter times 4 plus ... 1 on 2 to the n times 2 to the n. That's the typical term, all right? Forever, okay? So that's 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 forever, which equals infinity, all right? So it looks like, well, the expected utility of this game is infinite, and according to expected utility theory, apparently, you should be prepared to pay any finite amount to play this game, and you should think you're getting a fantastic deal, by the way, because the expected utility is infinite and you're paying some finite amount, okay? But that seems crazy. Most people wouldn't pay, I don't know, more than $30 or something for the game that I just described, okay? Certainly they wouldn't be prepared to, clean out their bank account and, take on an enormous loan and sell their house and everything to play this game once, okay? And the thought is, look, because it's extremely probable that there'll be a relatively small return on this game, okay? So what the paradox is playing on is what's going on in the tail of the probability distribution, tremendous rewards corresponding to extremely improbable outcomes. Okay, that's the St. Petersburg paradox. Now, expected utility theory has, I would say, 4 moving parts, and each of these we could tweak to try and address the St. Petersburg paradox. Okay, so here are the moving parts. There's probability, okay? There's utility. There's this combination rule, okay? Expected utility, namely this certain multiply and add rule. And then there's the operation that you're supposed to do at the end. You're supposed to maximize that quantity according to the combination rule, okay? So 4 moving parts. And I'd like to taxonomize the main replies to the St. Petersburg paradox according to tweaking one of these parts. And then the final reply will be, or you just bite the bullet and you say, yes, you really should value this game infinitely. Okay, so let's just quickly talk about that. You could do something to the probabilities. So this is what I take Lara Burszak to be doing with her risk-weighted utility theory. So you don't just plug in the probability like a half, quarter, eighth, as I said before, you take some function of that utility. And depending what that function is, you might actually rein in the St. Petersburg game utility, expected utility. All right, the second thing you could do is do something to the utility. This was Bernoulli's response. So remember, I imagined that you just value the payoffs at their dollar amount, okay? Utility equals dollar amount. But actually, that doesn't seem very plausible. You know, there's this phenomenon, what we call diminishing marginal utility. You know, a dollar is worth more to a pauper than it is to a billionaire. So it seems that the increment of an extra dollar, you value less and less, okay? The richer you are, the less the extra dollar is worth to you. Okay, so in particular, if you imagine that the real utility function is some concave function, I'm trying to draw with my hand a concave function of the dollar amount, then you may not necessarily get an infinite expected utility at the end. So for example, Bernoulli thought that the utility of the dollar amount goes by the logarithm, really. You take the logs of the dollar amounts, that's what the utilities are. And it turns out if you plug that in the expected value, expected utility calculation, you no longer get infinity. You get a finite value, okay? Then there was the combination rule itself, expected utility, that sum of products, which we've talked about. Well, look, there are various alternatives to that. I don't know, there's maxi min, or there's maxi max, or there are various things you could do instead of, you know, focus on this expected utility thing. And then finally, there was that operation at the end, which was maximize this thing, expected utility. Okay, well, there are alternatives to that. For example, a very silly alternative would be to minimize expected utility. Okay, so no one should recommend that. But maybe more sensible would be to satisfy. Okay, you should choose an option that has sufficiently high expected utility, even though it doesn't necessarily maximize it. By the way, this is related to something we talked about, feels like roughly half an hour ago, when we were imagining the ever better wine, and you know, God can't maximize when there are better and better infinities without end. Okay, the thought here might be it's good enough to pick a sufficiently high expected utility, not necessarily one that maximizes. Okay, those are four responses to the St. Petersburg paradox that somehow tweak the expected utility maxim. And then the final reply is to bite the bullet and to say, well, I know it's a little bit unintuitive, but actually you should value the St. Petersburg game infinitely. And here's a quick argument for that. It's a dominance argument. So imagine various truncations of the St. Petersburg game. All right, so here's the first one. Instead of letting the coin tosses, you know, play out as they might, if you don't see the first heads by the 10th toss, call off the game. You just go home at that point. All right. Now, that's a finite problem, and it seems that finite expected utility theory gives an answer. You should value that at 10, right? 10 units, or in this case, $10. Now consider truncating the St. Petersburg game at the 11th toss, all right? Seems like the value of that game is 11. Consider truncating at the 12th toss. If you don't get the first heads by the 12th toss, we call the game off. Seems the value of that game is 12. And so on. So consider these various ways of truncating the game at a finite point. Now, the St. Petersburg game itself is better than each of them. So it seems that its value is greater than 10, it's greater than 11, it's greater than 12, etc. It seems like it's greater than every one of these finite games. Well, That's what we said at the beginning. That's infinity. You should value it more than every finite game. Maybe that's a more careful way of saying it. Doesn't mean you should outright pay infinity for it, but you should value it more than every finite amount. And that's already paradoxical enough. So that's a way of biting the bullet using a sequence of dominance arguments. So those are 5 ways of responding to the St. Petersburg paradox. And in a moment, I think we will talk about how there are parallels to Pascal's wager. Maybe Liz would like to come in at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I wanted to bring this up. I mean, both because I think, well, maybe I'll say this first. Like, we're talking about the hardest cases, right? Expected utility theory is a very useful and straightforward tool in many, 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 many cases. So you might, hear this and say, wow, why are you even considering expected utility theory? This is leading to all these crazy results and I should empty out my bank account for this coin flip game and, whatever. But like, actually, we're considering the edge cases where all the cases in between, I think, are straightforward and powerful and useful and intuitive. So I'll say that first. But the reason I wanted to bring this up, I mean, I think there's really interesting parallels between the St. Petersburg game and Pascal's wager, and in particular, those 5 responses Al was just giving. I mean, you can see them almost in 2 ways. One way is you could see these both as puzzles or paradoxes. So St. Petersburg game says you should pay any finite amount of money to play this game. Pascal's wager says you should wager on God. Both of those seem paradoxical. So there's like 5 ways out. But I also think these 5 ways, if you're kind of on the other side of things and wanting to maybe fix the wager in light of problems that come up, these are also 5 things you can play with in order to maybe fix the wager in light of mixed strategies or something like that. So anyway, I don't know, do we want to, maybe we could mention some of those in detail, how they work on the wager?
Yeah.
Al, the St. Petersburg thing is more your wheelhouse than mine, but maybe I'll start and you can come in as needed. So the first was kind of playing around with the probability, the way the probability function works. So one thing you could do in response to Pascal's wager that we already talked about, especially if you assign God's existence a quite low probability, is discount that down to 0. And that would be a way to get the result that you shouldn't wager on God. You're kind of rounding down, like the Pascal's mugging thing we talked about. So the utilities, how would you get out of the paradoxical result of Pascal's wager using utility? I mean, you use utilities you can respond to mixed strategies and many gods by like bringing in finite utilities, but yeah, what would you say there, Al?
Yeah, that's right. This is maybe an interesting disanalogy between St. Petersburg and Pascal's wager. In St. Petersburg, each of the possible payoffs were finite.
Good. Yeah.
When you combine them in this expected utility way, you get this infinite answer. That's, by the way, another of the paradoxical features of the St. Petersburg game, that every possible outcome is finite. How can you value that infinitely? Pascal's wager is different, that salvation allegedly has this infinite value in one hit, so to speak. But then, as I think we gestured at earlier, there's a finite version of Pascal's wager which avoids lots of the problems to do with mixed strategies and weird features about that figure 8 infinity. Just replace the infinity of salvation with some very big finite number. I called it big F, and do the expected utility calculations on that. And there's nothing paradoxical there. The decision theory seems to go quite smoothly.
Yeah.
So that would be on the utility side. Back to you, Liz, if you like.
Yeah. So then the combination rule. So I suppose you could appeal to different combination rules and get the result that you shouldn't wager depending on the combination rule in question. And then with expected utility, one thing you mentioned was like whether can we satisfice rather than maximizing. And it gets interesting there too, partially because of the disanalogy where satisficing in this case would mean picking a finite option over an infinite one.
Exactly.
And that
doesn't
seems
seem
like a way to satisfice. Yeah. So
that's right.
Yeah.
And then
Bite
biting the bullet
yeah.
is you do what Pascal says. Yeah.
Yeah. And then like one thing that's interesting, I mean, I think you talked about this in your conversation. I listened to Rob Wiblin, who does the effective altruism stuff, interviewed you, but you said it's interesting because a lot of people like would say like you shouldn't empty out your bank account to play the St. Petersburg game. But there's actually a number of people that are like, no, of course you should like take Pascal's wager. And I actually present this like to high school students sometimes in classrooms, and like a bunch of them are like, oh yeah, of course, like that's the right result. So there's paradoxes there, but maybe people respond differently to the paradoxes. And of course, people think you should bite the bullet in the St. Petersburg game, but that's maybe you and a few others, Al, no offense.
I have given that dominance argument, but I know
you're not your distance from your.
I don't want to be too committed to that. Yeah. That was good, Liz. Yeah, thanks.
But it's fun. I was telling Al I subbed for a class on infinities, and I actually had them play this game, so I gave them all like thousands of dollars of Monopoly money, and then I was like, we'll do this, and it was fun to see how much they would pay, but most of them it was like less than $100. So yeah, but it's a fun paradox. So
yeah, good.
I don't know if you guys have any last words before I do my little outro. So maybe we can start with Al and then move to Liz, and then I'll do my little closing.
Yeah, I hope this came across. Look, Pascal's wager is just 3 pages long, something like that in the Pensée, and yet it's generated this huge literature. I mean, not bad for a day's work from Pascal, right? And as we like to say, if you measure the sort of philosophical punch of a piece of philosophy by, sort of the ratio of the number of citations to the number of pages, it's pretty hard to beat Pascal's wager. So I mentioned earlier the ontological argument. That's obviously a very important argument in the philosophy of religion. I think Liz mentioned the problem of evil. There are certain classic arguments in the philosophy of religion. Those are some of them. Pascal's wager is right up there in the sort of hall of fame of the most famous arguments in the philosophy of religion. But I think none of these other arguments has so much currency now. There's still lots of discussion, and Pascal's wager is generating real developments, today in decision theory and thinking about infinity and so on. More so than the ontological argument and the problem of evil and so on. So I think Pascal's wager is very much alive today. And as Liz also mentioned, it's also relevant to various very live debates in ethics, long-termism, effective altruism, and so on. So I think Pascal's wager is as alive today as ever.
Yeah, I agree. I think Brian said the only paper that might rival the wager for number of pages to citations is maybe Gettier. And everyone talks about Gettier and his short little paper that demolished the theory of knowledge. So it's cool that Pascal is up there. Maybe Pascal even wins. I don't know. But yeah, I totally agree. There's so much rich work on, the rationality of religious belief, things in economics, things in math, things in philosophy of religion. Really, it's like, even I just was working on our bibliography for our paper, which is just scratching the surface of the literature on this, and we're citing papers in like 3 or 4 different disciplines. So yeah, I just want to echo what Al said, and yeah, Pascal's wager has been really influential. People have applied it to things like abortion and euthanasia and how we should respond to the possibility of, AI is this huge question. A lot of people have been interested. Just look at Phil Jobs, right? Like, everyone wants people that work on AI. And people have actually drawn specific connections between Pascal's wager and AI, basically saying maybe we should be a little bit more cautious in the same way that like there's this element of risk that we're considering when we're deciding whether to believe on God or wager on God or not. Maybe we also need to like equally consider risk and like how we're kind of using and developing AI. So there's really implications for so many different fields. And yeah, I like how Al put it. It's alive and well and interesting, and lots of fun things to think about in this field. So
yeah, and more so than Gettier. I don't think Gettier has had such influence in all of these other areas.
No. To be clear, I was talking about citations, but you're probably right. There's still more citations, but
quite right. That's right. Yes.
But like, it's undoubtable to me. It's more interesting. I usually say like,
Yes.
I really like epistemology, and I'm interested in everything epistemology except for getting your problems.
Right.
Anyway,
all right.
not to hate on getting it, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you guys both again for coming on. For the audience, check the links in the description to some of their papers that I put down there. And of course, if you've made it this far in the video, you probably see value in the work that I do. So please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Links to both of those are in the description. Any amount helps me pay off my student debt from undergrad, helps me through grad school, and so much more. So thank you to all my existing patrons. And yeah, please consider that. And of course, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.